Happy Thursday, Cali X Boxing 2.0, Cali X Boxing 2 over on Twitter. Happy Thursday. Que bueno, mi gente. Hasta. Well, I don't know what to say. Good morning. How you say good morning in Spanish? However you want to say it. Cali X Boxing 2.0 here. And let me tell you, numbers are solid. Appreciate all the support I'm getting in the archives as well as people who are joining me live and who have been joining me live. Hit that like button as you come in and leave a comment. Let us know who's in the building. Throw your name out in the chat. As you can hear, I'm still struggling with my voice. So no telling how long this one's going to go. Still struggling with the swollen gland and all that stuff. So going to try to go as long as I can. Yeah, man, I'm on my Rosetta Stone right now. So I learned and I forget. Buenos dias, that's how. Shout out my guy, Chauncey Pearls, man of his word, the man of his word over there. A lot to talk about. We're going to talk Undisputed. We're going to talk what it means. Is it as meaningful as people say? We're going to be talking about Pedraza versus Commey. We're going to get straight into that, betting odds and how we should look at this fight. And also, pound for pound debate is in full effect. And it's obvious why the pound for pound debate is in full effect, because Usyk just won. Usyk has won his rematch. So you have all kinds of debates out there. Should Usyk be pound for pound? Should we have heavyweights on the pound for pound? Who do you have 1 through 10 on your pound for pound? Should fighters who are undisputed automatically get into the pound for pound list? There are all types of discussions going on out there this week since Usyk won. And Ring Magazine dropped their top 10 pound for pound this morning, and people are starting to lose their minds, right? Should Lomachenko still be on the pound for pound list? Should Lomachenko be ranked higher than Devin Haney pound for pound? All of these discussions are going on out there. My general rule on pound for pound is it's impossible. I do my pound for pound list. The reason I do my pound for pound list is I was one of those people who complained about everybody's pound for pound list, but didn't have one of my own. And then when I started to formulate one of my own, I realized quickly that I had like 50,000 fighters in my top 10 pound for pound, and I had no idea how to rank them. So it's a good exercise to do to keep yourself honest, right? To do pound for pound rankings and divisional rankings. And I'll show you mine that I formulated this morning and through the week on my one-person panel on calixboxing.com. I'll be screen sharing that in a minute and showing you my top 10 pound for pound list and my top 5 divisional rankings. But it's easy to criticize everybody else's pound for pound rankings if you don't have one. My general rule is I have mine. It's very subjective. I don't hold it above anybody else's because I realize it's extremely subjective, and it can't be objective, because when it's objective and too rigid and you hold yourself to a rigid set of rules to something that's supposed to be subjective, when you try to make something that's subjective objective, you get what BoxRec gives us when it comes to their pound for pound rankings. In a way outside the top 20, stuff like that, right? When you try to be so objective with something that's meant to be objective, it goes haywire. It goes left. And also, on top of that, it's meant to be fun. It's meant for engagement. It's meant to have dialogue back and forth, a fun time back and forth. No, I think this fight is better than that fight. No, I think that better. There's no way of telling if we shrunk or blew up every fighter to the same size who would be better. Some people hold resume as more valuable. Some people hold the eye test as more valuable. For some people, it's more of a mixed bag than others. It's just a tough thing to do. So just remember, have fun with it. That's right. A lot of people have forgotten that Commey versus Pedraza happens this weekend. It's sort of flying under the radar. And that's where we are with this fight right now. And we're going to get into that in a minute. What's your updated pound for pound list? I'm going to give you that in about 10 minutes. 10 minutes. I want to hit on Commey versus Pedraza first. Shout out to AP. Salute Impala. El Cheeto BXN. Salute. And my guy Chauncey Pearls has Usyk number 1, Inoue 2, Charlo 3, Canelo 4, Spence 5. And that's solid. It's a solid list. Solid list. The only way Inoue could be on the pound for pound list is based on potential. His biggest win is a washed up Donaire. I disagree with that. Why isn't Crawford on my top 5? Is because he hasn't done anything of value since Undisputing 25 years ago. 25 years ago, huh? Let's get into Commey versus Pedraza real quick. This is a fight of two guys who have quality losses. This is a battle of guys with quality losses. Pedraza's a good fighter. Commey's a good fighter. Once they've stepped up, they've fallen down, right? They've never been able to get that top quality victory. They've always been a level underneath great, 2 levels underneath special. They've always been just good to really good fighters, but they are good to really good fighters facing off against each other in a fight that makes sense at this time, because you have guys coming off of losses. I think Commey has lost 2 out of his last 3. Pedraza is coming off of a loss, I believe. Pedraza's 29-4, 1 knockout loss, 14 KO victories. So a much lower KO percentage than our guy Richard Commey. Richard Commey, 30-4, 27 KOs. So a huge KO percentage. He's a guy who relies on the KO. He's a guy who relies on power punching over the jab. He can set it up with the jab, but he wants to knock your head off. That's Commey's game. Now, when I talk about quality losses, Commey lost to Lomachenko. He lost to Teofimo. That's 2 out of his last 3 losses. There's no shame in losing to Lomachenko. There's no shame in losing to Teofimo. But it just goes back to what I said. When Commey has stepped up to that level, he's dropped down. Pedraza, the same thing. Losses to Tank, losses to Zepeda, lost to Lomachenko, lost to Ramirez. All of his losses are quality losses. Neither one of these guys has lost to bad opposition. They're guys who beat the opposition. They're consistent fighters, is what I'm saying. They beat the opposition they're supposed to beat, and they lose to the opposition they're supposed to lose to. And keep that in mind for what I'm about to say. Richard Commey is the plus 230 underdog. Pedraza is the minus 280 favorite. When it comes to Pedraza and Commey, they beat the fighters they're supposed to beat. They lose to the fighters they're supposed to lose to. They're consistent. So what does that tell us in this fight? The odds makers have deemed Pedraza a pretty healthy favorite here. Minus 280. 2.8 to 1 favorite. They've deemed Commey the underdog here, a live underdog, plus 230. They beat the fighters they're supposed to beat. They lose to the fighters they're supposed to lose to. So that right there generally just tells me to go towards Pedraza. The over-under here is minus 380, plus 275. The over-under is 8.5 rounds. Now, I like the over, 8.5 rounds, but you got to take into account minus 380. You got to bet $380 to win 100. So I don't really have a strong feeling about this fight either way. I tend to think that they've got the odds right here. They played the value right. I tend to think that Pedraza should be the slight favorite here, and I lean towards Pedraza. I also lean towards the over. When it comes to how this fight will be won, Pedraza is not going to knock out Commey, in my opinion. And Comey's not going to outbox Pedraza for 7 rounds, in my opinion, in order to win a decision. He would have to get multiple knockdowns in order to win this fight, which he could by decision. So to me, it comes down to, will Commey get to Pedraza's chin before the 12 rounds, or will Pedraza be able to go the 12 rounds, outbox Commey without getting knocked out? It's either Pedraza decision or Commey knockout, in my opinion, Commey stoppage. So I lean towards Pedraza by decision, and I lean towards the over, obviously, 12 rounds. So not much value here, but I think they played it right, and I like Pedraza to beat Commey. Y'all let me know in the chat who y'all think is going to win that fight. My guy JC in the building. Usyk can't be on there. It defeats the purpose. Heavyweights are exempt. I'm going to get into that as well. You know what? Let's just get straight into it after I get to these comments. Bud Crawford is pound for pound #1 because Bud Crawford says so. I never rate heavyweights pound for pound. However, Usyk coming from cruiserweight is an exception. I'm going to get to that right out the gate. Crossroads fight, and that's what this is. It's a crossroads fight. Whoever wins this fight will go on to get another shot at an elite level opposition. That's what's going to happen here. So meaningful fight in that, right? Usyk is exception because he moved up. That's right. Let me get straight to it. Let me bring you to my pound for pound rankings right here. Let me know if y'all see. Y'all should see that. This is my top 12 pound for pound. Like I said, I'm different from everybody else. Everybody does a top 10 pound for pound list. My guy Hailstorm used to do a top 11, so I'm going to do a top 12. This is my top 12 pound for pound list. Usyk is the new pound for pound king. And y'all let me know who y'all's pound for pound king is in the chat. And y'all let me know. Just fire away at it. Look at the list, fire away at it. Let me know what y'all have issues with. Because I rarely, look, let me know what y'all have issues with when it comes to this pound for pound list. Usyk is the new pound for pound king, in my opinion. So let's attack that first of all. Usyk in 20 fights has fought in 8 different countries. He's fought 12 fights. He's fought in 8 different countries. He's fought on the East Coast and West Coast in America. He's done that in 20 fights, 8 different countries. He consolidated 7 of the 8 major belts. And if you count ring, 9 out of the 10 major belts in the 2 weight classes he's campaigned in. He's now lineal at heavyweight, and he was lineal at cruiserweight. So I've always said, I don't put heavyweights on my pound for pound list. I don't, but I don't put career heavyweights on my pound for pound list. Usyk is the exception because Usyk was on the pound for pound top 10 list at cruiserweight. Obviously, he was high on everybody's pound for pound list at cruiserweight. He became undisputed at cruiserweight, unified all the belts, was the lineal champion, and got on the pound for pound list. So when a guy who is on the pound for pound list moves up to heavyweight, I don't take him off of the pound for pound list just because he's a heavyweight. It's actually the opposite of that. He's actually adding to his legacy by going up a weight class and beating guys who are naturally bigger than him. So for me, he goes up to heavyweight, becomes the lineal king, unifies 3 of the 4 major belts. He moves up the pound for pound rankings. He doesn't come off of it. That's why Usyk being a heavyweight and being on the pound for pound list is the exception. I never put Vladimir Klitschko on my pound for pound list. I never put Tyson Fury, Deontay Wilder. That's just my rule. Other people disagree with me. And if you go back decades and you look at legit publications in the boxing world, Ring Magazine, others, there are examples of Muhammad Ali being the pound for pound king, Joe Frazier being pound for pound king. There are multiple examples, Larry Holmes being the pound for pound king. There are multiple examples of heavyweights, career heavyweights being the pound for pound king and being on pound for pound list. Not me. All right. So this is one of the many things that makes this list extremely subjective, because we can't even agree on who should be qualified for it and who should not. We can't even agree on that. So for me, career heavyweights are not on it, but guys who were on the pound for pound list and then moved on to heavyweight, moved up to heavyweight, I can't take them off the list just because they moved up to heavyweight. I can't. They're not career heavyweights. They were already on the pound for pound list. Usyk was on the pound for pound list. I'm sure as hell not going to take him off the list if he moves up to heavyweight. It's the exact opposite. If he does great at heavyweight, I move him up the list. And now he's number 1 on my pound for pound list. And y'all let me know. Do you have somebody else number 1? Do you have any issues with how I've listed these guys and what order I put them in? Usyk's the exception. Crawford should be like 8. Usyk number 1 for sure. HLD in the building. Usyk number 1, no question. Salute to you too, Matador. Let's see. You pretty much have the same list I do, the exception of Crawford and Charlo. Let's see. Calix, please enlighten me on the Inoue guy. Oh, I will. Give Bud Crawford $25 million to fight Spence somebody. And you know what's interesting about that? I hear all the time about how big of stars Spence and Crawford are and how great of a promoter Al Heyman is. Yet the Saudis are not. The Saudis forked up all kind of money for this fight and that fight and that fight. Yet they're not forking up money for Spence and Crawford. What does that tell you? What does it tell you? Haney at 12. Whoa, the disrespect. I'm gonna get into that too. Ring Magazine said that Mike Tyson was number 1 pound for pound back in the day, and that's another example. Better BF higher than Bam Rodriguez. I'll also get into that. Ring Mag had AB number 5 pound for pound too. I never had AB on my pound for pound list, so I would disagree with that. I have Lomachenko number 2 pound for pound, and I'll also get into that. Actually, let's get into that right away. Love Bam Rodriguez, but you got to at least put Haney above him. And this is the issue with pound for pound too, right? Is everybody's going to have their own what they weigh heavier than others. And if you actually sit down and do a pound for pound list, you'll see how difficult it is and how much you're nitpicking other people's lists. I'm a college football fan, so my pound for pound list is more like a college football top 25 list. It's weighed heavily on what have you done for me lately? What have you done for me lately? Also, with my pound for pound list is I think we have to reward guys. If we say Undisputed matters as much as we do, we all talk about how much we want to see Undisputed, how much we want a champion in each division. We have to reward Undisputed fighters with certain accolades once they become Undisputed. Number 2, we have to make it sustainable for them to defend Undisputed when they become Undisputed. Otherwise, how meaningful is it if they become Undisputed and within a year they're stripped of 3 belts, Josh Taylor, or they just talk about moving up a weight class after they become Undisputed? And one of the reasons is it's unsustainable to become Undisputed or to defend Undisputed when you become Undisputed is because of all of the sanctioning fees you have to pay for all 4 sanctioning bodies. To defend 4 sanctioning belts at the same time, simultaneously, at the same damn time. So how valuable is Undisputed really to us? Are we sending mixed signals to these fighters? We're telling these fighters we want them to consolidate all the belts. We want them to be the champion in their division. Yet at the same time, when they become the champion in the division, we're ranking fighters who are in the same division with them who have 0 belts ahead of them when it comes to pound for pound. And once again, pound for pound subjective. I get it. But we have to stop sending mixed signals at the same time. So that brings me to Devin Haney versus Vasily Lomachenko when it comes to this debate, because I think it's an interesting one to have, and there are good cases on both sides of it. I have Devin Haney in my top 12 pound for pound. I don't have Lomachenko in mine. And everybody who has followed me knows how high I am on Lomachenko. I'm a fan. I'm a big fan. I've never picked against him. And that went wrong for me twice, but I've never picked against the guy. I'm high on the guy. But at the same time, Devin Haney goes out there, consolidates all 4 belts in his weight class, becomes the undisputed champion in his weight. He has 4 belts. Nobody else has any. I think, in my opinion, I'm just speaking for myself, I have to put him on the pound for pound list at that point. And I've never agreed with the notion that you have to campaign in multiple weight classes in order to be on the pound for pound list or in order to be considered higher on the pound for pound list than other fighters. I think it's a case-by-case basis. Spence has campaigned in 1 weight class. He's on my pound for pound list. Jermell Charlo campaigned in 1 weight class. He's on my pound for pound list. For the most part, Dimitri Bivol. For the most part, Better Biev. For the most part, Shakur Stevenson. These are a lot of these guys are 1 weight class fighters. For the most part, Devin Haney. Bernard Hopkins, when he was at the top of the pound for pound list, he was a middleweight. Strictly a middleweight. Roy Jones, for the most part, was light heavyweight when he was a pound for pound king. There, he was super middleweight as well. But there are examples of guys being in 1 weight class, single weight class fighters who were on pound for pound list and on pound for pound list high. Alexander Usyk was a case of that when he was at cruiserweight, and he was high on pound for pound list. So I've never agreed with the notion that you have to be a multi-division fighter in order to be on the pound for pound list or be high on the pound for pound list. Actually, I appreciate fighters I appreciate fighters that go through weight classes, but I also appreciate fighters who stay in the weight class and they stay a stationary target. They collect belts, they unify, they become undisputed, then they stay in the weight class and defend their undisputed title. I appreciate guys like, if you look back in history, Joe Louis, 24, 25 defenses. All of the defenses that Bernard Hopkins had, they stayed in a weight class, they stayed a stationary target, they believed in belts, they believed in consolidating belts, they believed in defending belts, and they believed in taking on all comers in their division. And they realized that they can stay in the same division, and then the big opposition would eventually come to them. Gennady Golovkin staying at middleweight when people were telling him to stay a super middleweight, and the super fight with Canelo eventually came to him. Bernard Hopkins, Felix Trinidad came to him. Oscar De La Hoya came to him. They defended until the big fights came to them, and they defended their territory against opposition trying to take what was theirs. And I appreciate fighters like that, and I don't think we should penalize fighters like that by keeping them off of pound-for-pound lists when they do that. But back to Devin Haney versus Lomachenko. I just value what Devin Haney just did. I know it's Cambosos. I get it. But he put together a nice 3-fight run. What have you done for me lately? And he did what everybody says a fighter should do. He fought for all 4 belts. And we can debate and argue which undisputed is less valuable than the others. We can dispute that. We can debate that. But he's undisputed at lightweight. And we've said that lightweight supposedly is a strong division. He is the lightweight king. So I can't keep him off my pound-for-pound list in good conscience. Josh Taylor was pound for pound. He shot up to like number 6 on my pound-for-pound list last year. I thought he looked awful against Jack Catterall. And how my pound-for-pound list works as well is if I feel a fighter lost, if I disagree strongly with the scorecards, I just go with my scorecard when it comes to pound for pound. Not divisional rankings, but with pound for pound. So I took Josh Taylor off of my pound-for-pound list because I felt he lost to Jack Catterall, and now he's been stripped of 3 of the 4 major belts. So he's not even undisputed anymore. But this is my pound-for-pound list. Let me get to some comments real quick. Let's see. You have Lomachenko number 2 pound-for-pound. I just think that Lomachenko needs to do he's going to have his opportunities because he's Lomachenko. And it all comes down to how much equity have you built up, right? As a fighter. Has Lomachenko built up enough equity to still be ranked higher than the guy who has all of the belts in the same weight class? And that's the other side of the argument that I understand. I get it when the Ring Magazine people tell me that I still think Lomachenko has that much stronger of a resume than Devin Haney, so I got to rank him higher than him, even though he has 0 belts and Devin Haney has 4. A part of me gets that argument as well. He's built up enough equity to still be ranked above Devin Haney, according to them. And if I look at Lomachenko's resume versus Devin Haney's resume, I understand that argument. I understand champion at 126, 130, 135. Multi-division champion. He built up a bunch of equity before that. Yes, he loses to Teofimo Lopez, but he wins against Nakatani. He wins against Commey. Looks impressive in doing it. Gets back on his feet. Lomachenko was number 1 pound for pound, according to many people, in 2020 after the Teofimo loss. Does he drop all the way down that far? Does he drop all the way off the pound for pound list? It depends on how much equity you feel he built up. Canelo loses to Dimitri Bivol. I have Dimitri Bivol high on my pound for pound rankings, number 7. I view Dimitri Bivol as a great quality fighter when he fought Canelo. I can't in good conscience drop Canelo all the way down from number 1 all the way off the list. To me, Canelo Alvarez went as far as 4. That's as low as I could drop him. I can't keep him at number 1, obviously, because there's no precedent for a fighter losing and staying at number 1 pound for pound. But I'm also not going to drop him all the way up because he had built up so much equity. He was so active when the other fighters were inactive. He fought 4 times in an 11-month period. He became undisputed in his weight class. You don't take all that away and drop him off the pound for pound rankings just because he goes up a weight class to fight a special fighter and loses that fight. So for me, he didn't drop as low as 4. So equity comes into the question as well. How much equity have these fighters built up? So when people have Lomachenko in their top 10 pound for pound, I get it. I don't get upset when I see it. I don't. Because he built up a lot of equity before that Teofimo loss, and he came back after the Teofimo loss with 2 solid wins, and he's back active in a couple months, and it looks like he's going to fight for Undisputed in the spring. So I get it when people have Lomachenko in their top 10 pound for pound still. For me, just go back to this. I view it more like a college football top 25 ranking. I place a lot of value on what you've done recently. And there were too many great performances early in this year, first half of this year, in order to keep fighters on who hadn't done as much as of recently. So when you see guys like Haney, Undisputed, Chocolatito for me was the fighter of the decade from 2010 to 2020. 26 fights throughout 4 major weight classes, throughout 4 weight classes, won titles in those 4 weight classes, major belts, had 20 knockouts. So Chocolatito had more knockouts than most fighters had fights in that decade. He had built up so much equity with me. And like I said, I had him beating Gallo Estrada. So that's how I view pound for pound rankings. I had him beating Gallo Estrada. So to me, Chocolatito has built up enough equity to stay on the list. That's why I got him at 11. Bam Rodriguez. Why do you have Bam Rodriguez on the list? Well, he moves up 2 weight classes on short notice, beats Carlos Cuadras, defends in the toughest weight class in boxing. He defends against the toughest SOB in that weight class, who you could argue won like 23, 24 straight fights and destroys him. Destroys him. That's why Bam Rodriguez, to me, it's not only that, but it's common sense. I watched Bam Rodriguez fight, and I said, it's one of the best fighters in the world. Same thing with Shakur Stevenson. I haven't seen Shakur Stevenson definitively lose a round yet. You could argue he's lost this round, he's lost that round. I get it, but I haven't definitively seen Shakur Stevenson lose a round yet. It would not shock me 2 to 3 years from now to see Shakur Stevenson number 1, number 2, number 3 in the pound for pound rankings, because he's being aggressive with his career as well. Herring, Nakathila, Herring, Oscar Valdez, and now Consacao, who many people felt beat Oscar Valdez. He's being aggressive, and the move to 135 is going to be successful for him. And on top of that, the odds makers agree that Shakur Stevenson is high because they have him minus 2,000 against Consacao. Huge favorite. And on top of that, mythical odds on mythical fights. Odds on mythical fights. Shakur Stevenson is a heavy favorite against everybody in his weight class at 130. And if you put him in mythical matchups at 135, and I know we don't fight the fights on paper, but what I'm saying is, on paper, the odds makers view him as the favorite against everybody at 135. That's Devin Haney. That's Lomachenko is more of a toss-up fight. But it wouldn't surprise me to see Stevenson as the slim betting favorite going into that fight. Tank Davis, Kambosos, Ryan Garcia, if he was at 135, he's the favorite against all those guys. So why do I have Beterbiev at number 8? The knock that I have on Beterbiev is he's not active. He's injury prone. But at the same time, it's hard to keep a guy off the rankings who has been that dominant. 100% KO percentage in his weight class. And he's consolidating belts at the weight class. He's 1 fight away from Undisputed. I have him at 8. Dimitri Bivol, I view that win against Canelo higher than it seems the public. It seems like we're glossing over that win like it wasn't a special win. He was a huge underdog going into the Canelo fight. Plus 500. Big underdog. Plus 450, plus 500. And he goes in there and wins 9 or 10 rounds against Canelo. Canelo was seen as unbeatable by a lot of the public going into that fight. And we sort of revised history months later, like, oh yeah, Bivol was going to beat him the whole time. No, that's not what people were saying. Go look at the receipts. Everybody, almost everybody was picking Canelo to win that fight. Yeah, but he was moving up a weight class. He's not a real 170. I'm telling you, the view at that point was Canelo can translate at 175 and it can even possibly translate to cruiserweight. Bivol puts on a clinic and says, go back down to 168. This is not for you up here. It's not for you up here. I'm kicking you back down. Go back to 168. He was dismissive of Canelo. Outboxed him, and then after the fight said, I want to become undisputed. I'd rather fight Better Beef than Canelo rematch. He was dismissive of him. Bivol is a hell of a fighter. Number 7 is statistically the best defensive fighter in the sport. The second best defensive fighter in the sport statistically is Shakur Stevenson at number 9 on the pound-for-pound list. Errol Spence Jr. at number 6. Why do you have Errol Spence Jr. so high? The reason that's another one. People either think I have Errol Spence Jr. too high or too low, which tells me that I have him right around where he belongs. The Errol Spence Jr. fans think he should be somewhere between like 2 or 3. I've even seen some of them put him as high as number 1, which is crazy to me. But I value fighters who stay in a single weight class and defend, unify, defend. And Errol has done that for the most. I've had my frustrations with Errol Spence Jr. too. Not fighting the fights that I wanted to see at the time when they should have happened. But overall, when you look at the picture, it's common sense. The eye test tells us he's a great fighter, but at the same time, he's unified. He's collected 3 belts in the weight class. And he wants to stay in the weight class and defend, it looks like. He's done that over an extended period of time. Jermell Charlo at 5. You already know how I feel about Jermell Charlo. Jermell Charlo becoming undisputed in that undisputed run at 154, a tough division in which guys at the top are mixing it up with each other. I guess I value that higher than others, and we have to value undisputed. And I'm going to get to that portion of this in a minute. Canelo at 4. I can't drop him lower than 4. I think he's just built up too much equity. Number 3, Terence Crawford. And that's another one. It's another tough one. It's equity versus inactivity. He's not been as active as he should be. The resume not being there at 147 is beyond him for the most part. But the eye test, him becoming undisputed at 140 on top of what he's done so far at 147, the little he's done at 147, I think that gets him to 3. Inoue, why is Inoue so high on my list? Some people say, well, what he's done, 18, I believe he's been in 18-0 in championship fights. And he's done that throughout 3-4 major weight classes. He's collected belts in numerous weight classes, legit belts. He's consolidated 3 belts in his weight class, and he's about to fight for undisputed in December, and he will become undisputed. So you ask, why do I have Inoue so high? Eye test, on top of accomplishments and resume, on top of the entertainment value that the guy brings to the sport, knocking out people. And if Inoue was in a higher weight class, and if Inoue wasn't Japanese, he'd be higher on a lot of other people's pound-for-pound lists. And Alexander Usyk, it goes without saying. Alexander Usyk, in 20 fights, he's fought in 8 different countries, consolidated 9 of the 10 major belts in the 2 weight classes he's fought in, if we're counting the Ring Magazine lineal belts. He's been lineal champion at cruiserweight, undisputed champion at cruiserweight, now moves up to heavyweight and becomes lineal champion, and he owns 3 of the 4 major belts. The only one that he hasn't consolidated yet, he hasn't won yet, is the WBC. That's Alexander Usyk's resume on top of the eye test, the common sense test that tells us when we watch him fight that he's a great fighter. That's Alexander Usyk. To me, it's a no-brainer at this point that Usyk is a pound-for-pound king. And like I said, I can't take him off my pound-for-pound list just because he's a heavyweight, because he was on the pound-for-pound list as a cruiserweight. So if you're on the pound for pound list as a cruiserweight, move up to heavyweight, I can't take you off the list for going up a weight class and taking on more risk. It's the opposite. I move you up the weight class for performing well and being successful at heavyweight. I don't put career heavyweights on my pound for pound list, but there are exceptions if a guy was on the pound for pound list when he was in a lower weight class. So that's what I got as far as this pound for pound list. So have at it. Tell me what you hate about this list. I love Loma, but he can't be there right now. And for the most part, that's how I feel. For the most part, that's how I feel. I just think there are too many special performances that were put on so far this year to keep Lomachenko there right now. I'm not sure if he built up that much equity before that. Quality of opposition should trump hardware. Who have you beat? Yep, that's right. I don't have a pound for pound list. If you ask me who's the best fighter in the world today, it's Usyk, hands down. And that's what pound for pound was meant to be at the beginning, HLD. It was, look, we have a heavyweight champion. Let's crown a pound for pound champion. Sugar Ray Robinson is the guy. He's going to be our pound for pound champion. It was never meant to be a list, and I've heard D-Style talk about this a lot. It was never meant to be a 1 through 10 list. It's just a fun thing for us to do. And that's why I get frustrated when people get so bent out of shape about it. It's like, dude, it's just a fun exercise to do for engagement, to go back and forth with each other, to have some fun. But when guys start getting bent out of shape about it, like, oh, you can't have that guy that high, you can't have that guy, like, let's just have fun with it. Let's just have fun with it. We can criticize it. There's no problem in that. But when it starts to get to that other level, I see Shakur moving up ranking faster than Boots. Yeah, I agree. I like how Canelo moonwalked out of that Makabu fight. If Zerto beats Bivol pound for pound, yeah, I think so. I would have to put him there. Salute my guy Nando, who's always in the building. Always appreciate your support, mi amigo. How Arrow being number 1 is frustrating when you got Inoue number 2. I don't know what that means. Shakur looks like the future number 1 pound for pound. I was skeptical about him, but the ambition is there, and he's only getting better with each fight. That's what I'm saying. I think he has the highest ceiling of all the young American talent coming up. Him or Bam. It's either Shakur or Bam who has the highest ceiling. Haney has accomplished a lot with Undisputed, but I think he has a much lower ceiling than Shakur Stevenson, Bam Rodriguez. I think he has an even lower ceiling than Virgil Ortiz at 147. But Shakur or Bam, to me, those two guys have the highest ceiling of the two young American fighters. Of the young American fighters coming up, those two have the highest ceiling, in my opinion. Chicano Prophet, my guy, but Callis a pound for pound says only who can think beat anyone at any weight class. That has nothing to do with weight division or belts. That's what I've been told before. Yeah, everybody has their own thing. It's all subjective. Whereas Tyson Fury's accomplished, that's the thing. Like the unknown Dosser, the Ukrainian Dosser. Good Lord, that's the thing. I don't put career heavyweights on my pound for pound list. I don't think they were meant to be on pound for pound list. If you look at what pound for pound was meant to be, they weren't meant to be considered a pound for pound fighter. Starting to feel if Usyk beats Fury in Undisputed another away fight, because it will be in the UK, we can start making arguments of Usyk being one of the greatest of all time. And I think those if he beats Fury, those conversations will start. You better believe. You better believe. Canelo can't be in a pound for pound because he's a drug cheat. That's another one I've been told. Yeah, so all of that, and that's my pound for pound list. Very subjective, but there's the undisputed angle of this too. And we need to stop sending mixed signals when it comes to fighters. When it comes to fighters, when it comes to undisputed. The two issues I see with undisputed is we're sending mixed signals as to how important it is. Boxing fans do it, journalists do it, publications do it. And how high do we value undisputed? The second issue with undisputed is it's not sustainable to defend. When guys become undisputed, they act like they got to the mountaintop and let's move on to the next division, instead of sticking around to defend all 4 major belts. And one of the reasons why is the oppressive sanctioning fees. It's tough to defend all 4 major belts when you're paying 4 different sanctioning fees to 4 different sanctioning bodies in order to defend those belts. So it's not sustainable either. But also, we need to decide, as boxing fans and journalists, get on the same page for the most part. It's impossible to get on the same page, but for the most part, we need to decide how high of a value are we going to place on Undisputed. And there's multiple examples of this. Like, if we're going to say Undisputed matters, if we're going to say this is a sport, so we want the fighters in the division to all strive to going for these trophies, because in a sport, we have to have trophies that matter. If it's going to resemble a sport, we have to have that. You have to have something of meaning that fighters have to strive towards other than money. And that's the belts. That's the 4 major belts and the ring belt, if you want to throw that in for the lineal. So once a fighter gets that, on top of the belts, we have to throw out the accolades to these fighters who have strived to get those belts and successfully did it. So number one, the sanctioning bodies have to come together and say, you know what? If a fighter becomes undisputed, we have to hold them defending undisputed above everything else. We can't have a Josh Taylor scenario in which he's already stripped of 3 of the 4 major belts within a year. And on top of that, the sanctioning bodies have to come together and say, if we're going to value, if this thing is going to resemble a sport, we have to do this for the better of boxing. And they're not going to do that. We know that because they want to line their pockets. We have to come to an agreement where, say the fighter consolidates all 4 major belts, they only pay 1% sanctioning fee each, to where they're only paying a 4% sanctioning fee altogether to defend all 4 major belts. Something like that has to come into play, because it has to be a sustainable thing, number one. And number two, we have to reward these fighters' behavior if they're doing what we've said we wanted them to do. If we want to continue to get those actions from the fighters, if we want to continue to get that behavior from the fighters, right? So if Devin Haney becomes undisputed at 135, and we look at pound for pound list, and he's ranked lower than Lomachenko, who has 0 belts in the weight class. And like I said, I'm a Lomachenko fan. I would pick Lomachenko to beat Devin Haney slightly. But at the same time, Devin Haney just became undisputed. He just did it. So I don't see how. It's not that I don't see how. I just think that we should reward that guy for doing it by putting him on pound for pound lists. Not only putting him number 1 in the divisional rankings, but putting him on the pound for pound list above the guy who has 0 belts in the same weight class. And there are exceptions. I'm just not sure Lomachenko and Haney is the exception to that rule. Errol Spence Jr. campaigned in 1 weight class. Terence Crawford, multiples. Errol Spence Jr. has 3 of the belts. Terence Crawford 1. That's why I have Errol Spence Jr. ranked higher than Terence Crawford in my divisional rankings. But if you look at my pound for pound, it's the opposite. And it's the opposite because I think Terence Crawford, the eye test tells me he's better, and he's built up enough equity before he got to 147 in order to be ranked higher than Errol Spence Jr. on my pound for pound list. There are exceptions to the divisional thing. But when we look at the recent history of Undisputed, it doesn't seem sustainable to keep Undisputed once you get it. And it doesn't seem like we're rewarding these fighters who become undisputed enough as fans and journalists. And it seems also like there's a rift between journalists and the boxing fan. And it's the same thing with baseball. There's a rift between, there's a disconnect between the journalists and the baseball fan. Nothing shows that more than when it comes to drug testing, steroids, all that stuff, because the baseball fans didn't care nearly as much about steroids. We just wanted to be entertained that the baseball journalists were. We want Mark McGwire in the Hall of Fame. We want Sammy Sosa in the Hall of Fame. We want Barry Bonds in the Hall of Fame. We want Roger Clemens in the Hall of Fame. We want Pete Rose in the Hall of Fame. But they care more about this stuff than the baseball fans do, the journalists who are in charge of getting the baseball players in the Hall of Fame. And I got news for the baseball journalists. There's never been a pure era of baseball. Segregation before the 50s and the 60s. We talk about players being coked out of their minds in the 80s. How many sober innings did Doc Gooden throw? All right. And they're going to treat this era as different than the other eras. And it's the same thing with boxing journalists. And it was a decade ago, 15 years ago, when we were talking about drug testing, and the boxing fans as a whole were telling the journalists, we don't care. We just want to see the best fights. You're putting another obstacle in the way. Instead, we already have to worry about Top Rank versus Golden Boy. We already have to worry about Top Rank signing a long-term deal with HBO, Golden Boy signing a long-term deal with HBO, Top Rank with Showtime, whatever it was. And Al Heyman being in the mix now. We have to worry about networks. We have to worry about promoters keeping fights in-house. Now we got to worry about which fighter is with VADA, which fighter is with USADA, which fighter is with WADA, which fighter is with RUSADA. It's another Bloods and Crips situation. And boxing fans as a whole were telling journalists, we don't care about the drug testing. Just give us the fights. And I know this because we broke a story at Hailstorm Sports when Eric Morales got popped before the day before the Danny Garcia fight. We broke that story. And I caught a bunch of hell from Eric Morales fans on top of boxing fans in general for breaking the story, because all they wanted to know is the fight still on? I'm trying to find out what drug Eric Morales was popped for. And they're saying, we don't care. We just want to see the fight. That was a great teachable moment for me, that boxing fans don't care. And one thing the boxing journalists get right is that at least they're putting fighters who were popped or fighters who were known drug cheats in the Hall of Fame, which I agree with. But they're also sending mixed signals at the same time by trying to go after fighters and push drug testing, but at the same time putting them in the Hall of Fame. It's mixed signals. It's the same thing with Undisputed. How much value do we put on Undisputed? Because journalists keep telling the fighters, we want Undisputed. We want unification fights. But when Naoya Inoue signs a fight in December with Paul Butler, people are, Paul Butler. Butler, really? So I ask people honestly, and I even ask myself, I have these moments with myself when I look in the mirror and talk about this stuff. It's like when I talk in my head, because I'm a crazy boxing fan. Would I rather see Inoue versus Stephen Fulton Jr. at a 120-pound catchweight in December rather than Stephen Fulton Jr. versus MJ Akhmadaliev and Inoue versus Butler? Which one would I rather? Honestly, if I'm honestly asking myself, and that's what makes this tough. And I guess it goes back to it's a case-by-case basis. I don't know. But I'm glad Inoue is going for Undisputed. I'm glad Fulton versus Akhmadaliev will likely go towards Undisputed. And we'll have two Undisputed champions like possibly fighting each other in 2023 in neighboring divisions. I like the fact that we're seeing more unification fights. I like the fact that we see more Undisputed fights. I think when we use the 4-belt system the right way, it generally puts us in the right direction, right? Generally, when we're using the 4 belts as a navigational tool, it points us in the right direction. When we're seeing unification fights, Undisputed fights, yes, I'd rather see other fights other than Inoue versus Butler, but I know it's getting me in the right direction at the same time. I know it's still a great achievement. Yes, it's still Butler, but Inoue has put together the front end of this run, Undisputed run, was tough. The back end is going to be easy. So you got to take all that into account. But I just think overall we need to value Undisputed more. And we need to be on the same page more than we are as to how valuable Undisputed is. Because we went a long time without seeing Undisputed in the 4-belt era. And I think it's a good thing that we're seeing more Undisputed fights. We're seeing more fighters go for Undisputed. And I think Canelo has led that way. Canelo has put out the blueprint as to how that works. If you fight consistently, if you're fighting on a consistent basis, building an organic fan base, and you're going towards a sport. I know you're a prize fighter, but this is a sport. And in a sport, we have trophies. And you have 4 trophies, 5 if we're counting ring, in your weight class. You should strive to try to get all of those. There are one-offs. There are exceptions to that rule. But generally, you should be striving towards getting those trophies. And I think we need to be rewarding fighters who do that on a consistent basis, instead of fighters who are saying, I'll campaign in this weight class, that weight class, that weight class, because I don't care about the belts. Don't care. You don't care about the trophies. You're in a sport. You don't care about the trophies. If the trophies aren't valuable to you, at least go for them and try to make them more valuable by attaching your name to the trophy. I don't know. But that's just where I'm at with it. Undisputed has to matter because this is a sport at the end of the day. Undisputed has to be sustainable in order to defend once you get it. Pound for pound lists are very subjective. We shouldn't be taking them seriously, but at the same time, it's a fun exercise. And everybody's going to have their own view on what matters more when it comes to Undisputed. For me, it's more of what have you done for me lately, with exceptions if fighters have built up enough equity before what we've done recently. On top of that, it can't just be eye test. It has to be resume. You have to have a resume to back it up. We should be rewarding fighters who are taking on tough challenges on a consistent basis. And fighters who are undisputed generally have been undisputed or are undisputed are generally the ones who are taking on the challenges more consistently. So we should be rewarding them by putting them on the pound for pound list, even if they're only campaigning in one weight class or have only campaigned in one weight class. And on top of that, I lean towards Pedraza this weekend. Pedraza minus 280, and I lean towards the over of minus 380, over 8.5. I just think the safest play, if you're going to play anything, not much value here if you look at the odds, but if you're going to play anything, it's either going to be a Pedraza decision or a Commey knockout, and I lean more towards a Pedraza decision and the over, obviously, because I don't know if Commey's going to get to Pedraza's chin. And both of those fighters is a crossroads fight because both of those fighters have valuable losses. They've only lost to really good or great fighters. And I'll leave you with this point when it comes to that fight. Both fighters have proven that they win the fights they're supposed to win and lose the fights they're supposed to lose. When they step up, they lose. So what do the odds tell us? Pedraza is the minus 280 favorite. Commey is the plus 230 underdog. They've shown in the past they win the fights they're supposed to win. They lose the fights they're supposed to lose. Remember that. Pedraza is the favorite. Commey's the underdog. They win the fights they're supposed to win, lose the fights they're supposed to lose. I'll leave you at that. Appreciate y'all. I'll be back tomorrow. God bless. Thank y'all for joining me. Peace.